Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, our presentation of methodology that is part of the webinar series, the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series that is co-sponsored by IIQM at the University of Alberta, University of Georgia, and Atlas TI. Today, we have a presentation by Dr. Trena Paulus and Alyssa Wise entitled Looking for Insight, Transformation and Learning in Online Talk, Methods for Analyzing Online Conversations. And I'm Ricardo Contreras, and I will be saying a few words now. And the microphones, your microphones are muted, and they will remain muted throughout the session because we have a large number of attendees. However, you should feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation. As the presenters are talking, you may go to the question section in the GoToWebinar control panel, and there write down your questions. And at the end of the presentation, the presenters will answer those questions, okay? You can practice now just by saying hi, hi Ricardo, and I will be able to see that, okay? And I also want to check with you if you can all hear me well. If you can hear me well, please click on the hand icon next to your names in the GoToWebinar control panel. And I think you can all hear me well because I see some hands raised already. You may click on the hand icon again, and that will lower your hands. And now I would like to ask Julian Barabas from IIQM to say a few words introducing the presenters. Julian?
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. It's Juliana from Edmonton, and on behalf of IIQM, Trena Paulus is a professor in the research division of the Department of Family Medicine at East Tennessee State University. She's the co-author of Digital Tools for Qualitative Research and Looking for Insight, Transformation, and Learning in Online Talk. She studies the impact of new technologies on qualitative research methods, specializing in the adaptation of language-based research methodologies such as conversation and discourse analysis to understand online talk and text. Alyssa Wise is an associate professor of learning sciences and educational technology at New York University and the director of LEARN, NYU's pioneering university-wide learning analytics research network. She's the co-author of Looking for Insight, Transformation, and Learning in Online Talk, as well as over 50 peer-reviewed publications in leading academic journals, conference proceedings, and edited books. Building on over a decade of work studying online conversations using both qualitative and quantitative methods, her research currently focuses on the design of learning analytic systems that are theoretically grounded, computationally robust, and pedagogically useful for informing teaching and learning. Alyssa and Trena.
Thank you very much. Trena, I will now make you the presenter. And you have to, well, there you are. Okay, so now we can see your presentation, and go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank IIQM at the University of Alberta, as well as Atlas TI and the University of Georgia for this opportunity to present to you today. And just to thank you for that great introduction. And I thought we could just start by just sharing briefly what brought us to this project. So Alyssa and I actually met in graduate school at Indiana University. We're both alums there and have analyzed online conversations in an educational context for years and years, and then have branched out since then. And I've become increasingly interested over the years in just methodological alignment about being sure that these research studies are designed very robustly. And Alyssa asked me to co-author a chapter with her because I kind of bring the qual perspective and she brings the quant and computational and mixed methods perspective. And we just kind of went from there. And so, Alyssa, do you want to share a little bit about what motivated you to work on this book?
So I think part of this came from the fact that when we worked on the book chapter together, both Trina and I realized very quickly, even though we come from quite different traditions, I work in quantitative and computational methodologies. She works mostly in qualitative methodologies. There was a lot of commonalities in all of the things we did up until the point we did the actual analysis. And so all the things that we had to think about in framing a study, setting things up, making really important decisions about what we were going to look at, how, when, and why, there was a lot of similarities in how we were approaching it, and we both felt there wasn't a lot of guidance out there, that we were constantly having to help students and colleagues who would come to us with questions about how to do this kind of work. And we felt like the chapter just scratched the surface of what was possible, and so we were inspired to work on this book to really put down on paper, I think, a lot of the things that we had been doing as part of our practice for a long time, but there really was no guide out there of how to do a rigorous study of online talk, qual or quant, that's going to make sure that you are really making valid and trustworthy knowledge claims that actually answer the questions you want to answer.
Yeah, so to kind of bring you into this conversation with us about online talk, online talk can be defined in lots of different ways. In fact, we had a long conversation trying to figure out what we were going to call this phenomenon of how people interact together online as we were writing the book. So just take a moment to think about all of the different ways in which you have talked to people online over the past 24 hours, even if you just narrow it to the past day. So just kind of think about that. And as you think about all the ways, and I would venture a guess that you, if you're like me, you probably interact more with people online these days than face-to-face, which says a lot about our social world. So think about, what was the breakdown of, were you talking individually online to people? That could be something like a text message on your phone, versus a small group in a group chat, versus a large crowd, maybe talking into making a Facebook post. Where did each of these types of conversations fall in terms of synchronous and asynchronous? And if you're not familiar with those terms, traditionally synchronous is meant in real time, like when you're texting each other or doing a Facebook Messenger chat and you're both logged in at the same time, that's synchronous. Versus asynchronous, which is delayed time, like email or discussion posts in your online course. So did you have different experiences with synchronicity over the past 24 hours? What kind of topics did you talk about? And what was the purpose of these conversations? And then were there specific norms? For example, do you have a particular type of emojis that you use with some of these people? Are you politer in some of these online talk venues than others? Are you joking more in others? So just kind of think a little bit about your experiences with these online conversations and online talk. And our point with asking you to do that is that each of those characteristics, how many people are involved in the conversation, what the platform's like, how quickly messages are exchanged, actually influence the online talk in a particular way. And I'm sure you can already think a little bit about what that means. And that was something that we had to address in our book. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Alyssa to share a little bit about how it can impact the research design of online talk.
Thanks, Trina. So one of the things that we realized right off the start was there were some older taxonomies, I think particularly from Susan Herring, about what are the different features of the talk environment that might influence how the talk happens, but it hadn't really been updated for the recent technologies. So you can see on this slide, we have sort of 4 categories that help you think about what's the technological context in which you're working. And each one of these has some pretty important implications for what's going on. So for example, message size, for a long time, Twitter was limited to 140 characters, and that had really strong implications for how people talked, the kinds of abbreviations they used. In contrast, when Facebook made a change a few years ago to start to amplify any posts that were less than 85 characters, that means putting them in big, bold text, people started writing a lot of posts that were 86 characters long because they didn't want to seem like they were shouting. So one thing we found is that a lot of times you can see studies where people will say, oh, and there was a lot of short messages or long messages, but they don't necessarily have to do with what people were saying as much as how the technological situation was set up. A couple of other examples have to do with the storage structure. That has to do with, can you reply to anything that's come before or only the most recent comment? That affects who people appear to be talking to. It also has a big effect on what is read. One of the studies that we did looked at the differences in presenting sort of threaded online discussions in the standard way as this sort of linear scrolling page versus visualizing them as starbursts that radiated from the center out, and it really changed what people read. So a lot of work, if you're trying to say that a post was really important, got a lot of attention, it's super important to think about why it got that attention. It might be because of what the post said, but it could also be because of all of these other reasons. If you think beyond the messages to things about timing, Trina already spoke about synchronicity. Persistence is another one. Now that pretty much everything we say everywhere online exists forever, people are often more careful or hesitant or say things in couched terms. On the other hand, if you look at tools like Snapchat, where things are designed to disappear, people interact in a different way. With people, you can have identity and community markers. That has to do with, is your account represent you as a real person versus a persona? Can you have multiple accounts? If not, what I say on Facebook to my friends may be couched in the ways that I know professional colleagues will also see what I write. And one of the big things we found that with the privacy and filtering settings, conversations don't appear the same to everybody. So for example, WeChat, which is a Chinese chat tool, you only see parts of the conversation made by people you're connected with. So if Trina and I have different sets of friends with some overlap and we both are in the same conversation, we'll actually see different parts of the conversation. So this notion of conversation as this eternal, externally existing thing that everyone experiences the same is really questioned by all of that and leads us to think about really carefully what we're studying and what we can say about it. So this is an example of the technological context. The other thing that's really important to think about is the situational context. So these are other factors that will influence the conversation, but are less hardwired into the technology and more features of what's going on. So participation structure relates to some of the things that Trina mentioned about, is it one-on-one, small group, or large crowd? But you can also imagine how many people are involved. Is it a closed or an open group? Do people take on certain roles? Are there regulars, or is it a constantly group of new people? You might also think about why people are there. Are people there ostensibly to get information, or is it one of those informational forms where people are actually trying to build relationships, or are they looking for empathy and connection? This may relate to the kinds of activities that they engage in. Sometimes people will ask questions, sometimes people will debate replies, sometimes it's an asked and answered phenomenon. The last one to think about is norms, and that has to do with what are the ways that are accepted to interact in a community. In a lot of online communities, it's expected to be somewhat polite and kind, but there are certain forums like 4chan, for example, where that is not the expectation. You can also imagine if you look at things like Stack Overflow, if you don't phrase your question in a particular way with an extensible example, no one will answer it. So these norms can be shared explicitly or implicitly, but again, it's important to recognize all of these framing devices if you're trying to make sense of the talk that occurs. So for situational context, you can think about the who, what, where, not the when, who, what, why, and how. So what I just went through connects with one of the most important challenges in studying online talk, which is poor characterization of the technological or situational context. If you haven't said what you're studying, it's not always clear why the talk is happening the way it is, and more importantly, people won't be able to compare it to their own future situations. So what we found is the more clear you are about these different technological and situational contexts, the more people in future situations know which aspects of your talk they can expect to see as well. Some other challenges we found that we address in the book are unexamined assumptions about language. This is something that is really important to think about, whether you're imagining when you're studying talk that the talk is simply an expression of an idea some person already had in their head as an individual, or is the talk something that's being constructed through people? Are we thinking about studying text, or are we thinking about studying humans? If we're looking at humans, are we thinking about people as individuals or as groups? And if we're really thinking about groups, groups have to do with interactional processes, not just summing up the products of everybody there. We've seen problems with studies where people ask a certain question. For example, they want to know if something causes something else, but then they're not doing an experimental study, so they really don't have the opportunity to claim causality, and times where people are using inappropriate analysis tools. One final one that I think is really critical is making sure to pay attention to ethical issues. When is it appropriate to treat online talk as text? When do you need to ask people's permission? When is it okay not to? How do you protect the identities of those involved beyond not revealing their names? There can be ways that studying a community might bring attention to it in a way that could be detrimental to the community as a whole. Trena, do you want to talk about, I think you've seen a couple of these in practice that helped inspire us to create a book so people could avoid these pitfalls.
Yeah, I think the methodological misalignment happens a lot, and I see it a lot in maybe articles that I'm reviewing for journals, or reviewer questions to me, or committee questions when I'm working with students who are trying to design studies of online talk. And I think one of the biggest challenges is understanding the difference between making claims about people who are talking online versus making claims about the language and the text that they're exchanging online. Those two things are not usually the same thing. If you want to make claims about the people who are talking online, generally speaking, you need another data source besides just their online posts and their online conversations. Sometimes you don't even know who they really are, like on Reddit or on this online grief support group that I've done some research on, where people are posting not as their real selves. So you can't even make any claims about them as people because we don't know who they really are. Even when you do know who they really are, you would need to get, a survey or demographic information or other source of data in order to be able to make claims about them as people offline. And so that's a kind of misalignment when you try to make claims based on what people are saying online without other data sources to kind of give you a more robust measure of demographic characteristics or other sorts of performance indicators, if that makes sense. So what we did was kind of put together a research design framework in the book that tries to help researchers address some of these challenges. Walking through everything from very clearly identifying an object of interest, that is, do you know what it is that you're trying to study? We start with online talk as a very broad category, but how are you defining what you're looking at online in terms of insight, transformation, learning, or other outcomes? And then looking at what the assumptions are, and then the rest of this probably looks pretty similar to any research design framework. That's the dirty little secret about studying online talk. It's actually a data source like any other data source that you might have, and it doesn't mean that you get to skip all the other steps in the research process and just jump right to the online talk. And so we try to walk people through thinking step by step how to put a really congruent study together. So the first is figuring out what is the object of interest. What are you really interested in studying? Going deeper than just, I'm looking at online talk of a certain type. And in our experience, there's been three sort of ways that an object of interest comes to light for a researcher. It comes out of practice, it can come out of data, or it can come from theory. And so as one example, Dr. Mary Alice Varga and I did a few studies looking at online grief support groups and how people talk together about their grief online. And that came from a very practical concern. Dr. Varga was heavily involved in grief counseling and face-to-face grief counseling, and was really interested about the fact that there are these online grief support groups where people go instead of going to a face-to-face in-person grief support group. And so we wanted to understand what was happening there. Alyssa, do you want to share about an example of when your object of interest came from actually the data itself?
Yeah, so I think this is a funny one because I think when we started talking, I mentioned that this was often a starting point for studies, and I think you implied that hadn't been something you'd seen very much, which as a data scientist happens to me all the time. I mean, I literally have people dropping by my door and throwing data in my lap. So one really good example was a whole bunch of MOOC discussion data, and it was given to us as part of a data challenge, and they said basically, what can you do with this MOOC discussion data to help us understand whether students are going to complete the course or not? and if they're going to learn anything. And the first thing we did was we looked carefully and qualitatively at what was going on in all this talk that was dumped in our lap. And what we saw was that half of it had nothing to do with learning at all. It was social, it was logistical, it was organizational. And we had a hypothesis that talk might have an impact on whether people stuck around, but it wasn't going to necessarily impact learning because it wasn't about learning. So we were given this big mass of, thousands and thousands and thousands of posts. And the very first thing we realized we had to do based on examining it was we had to figure out when were people talking about the course and when they were talking about other things. And that actually turned into a whole study I'll talk a bit about later in how do you figure out what's going on in online talk, what they're talking about, and what do you do with it.
Great, thank you. And then the theory, of course, it is very common, for example, in studies of online learning for both Alyssa and I, is that there's a theoretical construct out there, a theory about how people learn, and we're interested in whether there's that theory is visible in online discussions, in online courses. And so that's kind of the third entry point into what your object of interest is. And an object of interest also might be focused on who, people, what, or how. And as an example of the online grief support group study, we were really interested in the how people were constructing their grief in these online forums, how they were making it visible, how they were using language to actually enact grief. We couldn't really study who because we didn't know who these people were in real life. And we were interested in more than just what they were talking about, but how they were talking about grief. How about your MOOC study, Alyssa?
Well, so in the MOOC study, as I mentioned, our first research question really was about the what, which was, what are they talking about? And we sort of said they're talking about learning content and other things. Then we had to break that down into smaller categories so that we could go through and hand code it and segregate the data. And then once we saw when people were talking about learning and what when they were talking about not learning, we could start to look at who was involved in which conversations. We were able to create sort of a Venn diagram of people who only participated in talk about the content of the course, people who only participated in social talk, and finally people who participated in both. And in that study, we ended up doing a follow-up that said, okay, how are they talking about each of these things? And so in that one, we ended up doing all three, but it was a sequential thing starting with the what, moving to the who, and then looking at the how.
And that's such a great example because all of these assumptions really matter because it's going to impact how you design the study. Everything from the kinds of data that you collect, which part of the online talk, to how you analyze it. So that's why really understanding and unpacking these assumptions up front can be so important. And so there are lots of assumptions about the object of interest, but also about the assumptions underlying how we view language, because in essence, all online talk is language, and there's lots of theories about language out there. And then there's also assumptions about knowledge claim. So I think, Alyssa, you were going to share a little bit about assumptions around the object in terms of group versus individual.
Yeah, so one thing I've seen a lot, especially in quantitative studies of online talk, is people say it's a group and we need to look at the group level, and then they go and they do some sort of coding of individual behaviors and then they add it up. And they sort of say, in this group, there was 20 comments that shared knowledge and 21 comments where people elaborated and 23 where they synthesized. But if you're trying to think of something really as a group process, summing up what individuals do isn't really a group construct at all. And so we were trying in our knowledge construction study to really question the assumption of what does it mean to look at what a group does. And so what we did was we looked at patterns in the group talk. And so we actually didn't differentiate between individuals in a group. We didn't know who was who. We didn't sum up individuals. And we just looked at how comments followed each other. So if somebody shared information, was the next person more or less likely to share information, or were they likely to elaborate? And what did somebody say that would cause a synthesis to happen? And so in our study, we said we need to take this notion of studying the group really seriously from a quantitative perspective by not just summing up what individuals did, but looking at patterns of interaction between them and what happened after what.
Yeah, that's great. And so looking at, and I've actually seen this before as well is that people want to look at individual posts, individual social media posts, and then make claims about groups. And that's an example of methodological misalignment. There's some problems with your underlying assumptions there that kind of need to be sorted through. And to go back to my example about looking at the online grief support groups, assumptions about language are really important. I, in my own work, and especially in this study of online grief support groups, I rarely, if ever claim that language represents sort of an interior belief or reality of that person. My epistemological belief is that we never know what's in people's heads. They could say all sorts of things. It doesn't mean they really believe or think that face to face or online, but we can see how language functions. And how choosing certain words constructs a certain version of reality. In this case, grief. What is normal grief and what's abnormal grief, and that is an assumption about language that means I can never claim anything about what people really thought or felt about grief, because that's not the assumption that I carry about how language functions. And then the last assumption about knowledge claims is that if you want to be able to generalize your findings and make claims that go beyond the one particular source of online talk, then really you need to be doing a kind of traditional experimental, quasi-experimental, more quantitative perhaps design that allows you to choose a sample, to do some sampling that can then be generalized to a larger population. If you aren't going to design your study that way, then you can make claims that are locally generalizable, naturalistically generalizable, but knowing what kind of claims you want to make is also an important assumption that will then feed into the research design. Okay, so once you think through all of these issues and assumptions around your object of interest, what you're really interested in and how you're defining it, the other thing to realize before we move forward is to not get carried away with this new form of online talk that you might be interested in. What we see a lot is, oh my goodness, there's this brand new form of social media. I don't think anybody's ever studied it before. I'm sure there's no literature out there at all that's relevant. I'm just going to go in blind. And that is hardly ever true, even if the platform looks somewhat different. And I'm trying to think, Alyssa, I can't even think of an example of like a brand new social media platform that's out there. Can you?
Oh.
Put you on the spot. We didn't practice this part.
No,
but if you think
not off the top of my
yeah,
head.
because anything I say is probably going to be old to most people who are listening. But so like when Reddit came around, which is not necessarily new, but I've had a lot of students recently who got interested in Reddit. You got to remember that social media wasn't called social media, but this online talk has been around according to this timeline since 1978. So most likely there's a lot of previous research that would be relevant in terms of the technological and situational characteristics, if not the platform itself. So this is just to encourage you to do a literature review of the previous studies that might have been done on similar platforms in terms of the characteristics, and then identifying kind of who the audience for your study is going to be, coming up with a research question and an approach. And that's kind of the next section of the book, is to kind of walk you through what you've probably may or may not have been exposed to in terms of research design, thinking about the literature review, your theoretical frameworks, and the methodology and research questions that would be most appropriate to answer those questions. And I'll just give you one example here of why it's important for all of those things to sort of be aligned as you decide to, before you can even, you really even should delve into this source of online talk, even though you may have a good idea of what source of online talk will help you get to your object of interest. It's important to kind of have an alignment. And here, this was a study that I did with Dr. Marianne Woodside and Dr. Mary Ziegler, and we talk more about this example throughout our book. The entry point, our interest in online talk, was a practical interest in what happens in these online graduate courses. As online instructors, we wanted to understand what was going on in the online discussions. So the object was the group meaning-making processes in online courses, and that's sort of a theory-driven question as well, because there's a lot of theories about how people learn through dialogue and online, and so that was our specific object of interest. We did a lit review and tried to find some theoretical frameworks, and we used narrative theories, dialogic theories, group learning theories, looked at a lot of previous research on online discussions in educational contexts to kind of help us get to our problem statement, which is that yes, online discussions have been studied extensively, but few have used dialogue itself as a theoretical framework for investigating meaning making. Now, this was about 10, 15 years ago that we did this study, and of course, there's been much more of this since then. And our very specific research question that came out of that was, how do people make meaning of their own experiences in light of others' experiences through dialogue? And that was in the context of a graduate level online course that was situated out of the adult learning program. So that's just to kind of show you how, it is part of a process to kind of be sure that you're aligned. And then from here, you want to be sure that your research questions can be answered by the data source that you choose. And so at this point, we're getting to the point in the process where we can attend to the actual data source itself. And we want to be sure to distinguish here the difference between pre-existing online talk and researcher-generated online talk, because this does have a lot of implications, especially for ethics. Whiteblaze.net is an online community that's been around for a really long time. It's an example of pre-existing talk. It's a community, as you can see here, of Appalachian Trail enthusiasts. They do a lot of discussions about getting ready to through hike the Appalachian Trail, which is a long distance hiking trail on the eastern part of the United States. And it takes a lot of planning because it can take 6 months to do this hiking. And so with pre-existing talk, and this is just a very kind of old school threaded discussion, but some characteristics of pre-existing talk that kind of matter when you're wanting to do research is it's there happening whether the researchers are there or not. If I never looked at this conversations would still be going on. The researcher doesn't have to be there for the community to exist. People are often posting under pseudonyms. Here we see posts by Kevin 1 or 1000 and Muddy Waters. We don't know who these people really are unless we, tried really hard to go through some internet analytics to find out who they are. It's visible often to the entire world. Now, this is not true of some social media platforms like Facebook where you have to actually log in, but with these sorts of forums, it's there if you have an internet connection. You don't have to log in or be a member in order to read these posts. And so the researcher really does not have any control over what's happening here. It's just happening. And if as a researcher, you're interested in looking at it, that's going to require some different approaches than if we were looking at researcher-generated talk. And this is just a screenshot from a learning management system in graduate courses at the University of Georgia, for example. Researcher-generated talk is that in which the researcher is more directly involved, possibly in the kind of talk that takes place. Like when I have done studies of online courses, sometimes I am the instructor or I'm brought in alongside the instructor to help do a research study of that talk. And so this is just an example of what those discussions look like. And I wanted Alyssa to go ahead and talk about her experience with using researcher-generated talk, and in contrast with pre-existing talk, what some of those considerations might be.
Thanks, Trina. Well, I think it's pretty different. So, I mean, the first thing you have to think about is if you are going to generate the talk, what do you want to control and what do you want to just let happen? There's a lot of decisions to be made about, do you want to frame. You can go back to the situational and technological context that I said earlier. How much do you want to frame the topics? How much do you want to assign roles to the people? How much do you want to dictate the activities or the ways in which people interact? There's a long tradition in computer-supported collaborative learning of scripting how people interact with each other, which can be really powerful to support learning. But of course, then people are going to hopefully do what you ask, and then you can't really claim that that's just what happened. So I think figuring out what you want to control and what you want to let happen is a really big important part of it. The other thing is, as you mentioned, these are not open to the world. These are often very private settings where you really have to think about privacy and the need to get consent from people. And I think there's really two key ways to get consent, and you need to figure out which one is which. One of, I think, the easiest and safest ways to do it is to consult with the instructor, come up with a plan that you both agree is educationally valuable, and it happens for everybody. It's just business as usual for the class, and then at the end you ask people for permission to use their data, and they either consent or don't. And that's sort of the simplest way to do things. But if you want to do a study where you're studying groups, and this goes back to your assumptions, if you're caring about making claims about groups and you do it that way, and then you get a bunch of data with people from different groups, you can't study the groups because you can only look at one person from each group, and that doesn't let you make the group analysis that you needed. So in that case, you actually have to ask people ahead of time who's willing to consent, and then potentially make groups that put people who are willing to participate together. So this is, I think, a really good example of how knowing what you want to study and what assumptions you're making, for example, about groups versus individual, at the very beginning helps you design the study. And of course, if you're doing quantitative work that has an experimental component, then you have to think about, can you design both an experimental and control group? And of course, what are the ethics around that? In one study I did, we wanted to assign students online roles, and we wanted to study the different roles, but we didn't want to have ethical concerns of anybody not getting to play a role. So we had every person play a different role every week and rotate those. And then at the end, we didn't study people as humans, we studied people as roles and looked for consistencies in how people in particular roles acted in the forums.
Great, thank you for that example. So this brings us down then, pre-existing talk versus researcher-generated talk, to the part of the framework in the book where we do talk about deciding to treat online talk as data. Because remember, it's not data until we decide that we're going to treat it as data. And so there can be some issues here around ethical extraction of data, especially with pre-existing talk. Where people are talking together online and may or may not have any idea that researchers are there looking. And so I point you all to the Association of Internet Researchers 2012 Ethical Decision Making in Internet Research document. This professional organization has been around for a very long time, since the very early days of internet research. And I always point students and look myself at these decision-making points when deciding, do we need informed consent, for example, before we look at people's online posts? And you would be surprised by how many publications are out there looking at online talk of various sources that never talk about ethics at all, because for a long time, it was sort of seen as fair game. If there's something publicly available on the internet, it's like I had an IRB officer tell me once that it's like somebody talking on a street corner. It's public, it's there, you can treat it as data. But that, of course, has changed a lot in the past few years as people are realizing more and more about who has access to all sorts of different types of our data that are out there online. But some things briefly to think about is the public versus private nature of the posts. There is something of a difference between fully public posts that don't require a login screen to read them versus something that's behind a Facebook or Instagram login screen. There's a difference between whether you're just observing what happens as a researcher or if you're actually interacting with, interviewing, talking to the people who are making the posts. The sensitivity level of the topics, if these are people talking about very difficult issues, that they probably would be more concerned about people looking at in terms of for research purposes, as opposed to like a hiking community where people are sharing tips about sleeping bags. That might make a difference. And then how vulnerable people are. Do you know that everybody in this forum is over 18, for example? Are any of them vulnerable in ways that as researchers we need to be careful not to put them at risk? And then even if we would want to get informed consent, is there even a way to contact them to get their informed consent if you don't know who they really are online? And would contacting them actually cause more distress? So these are just a few things. And I will also just mention that there are other legal issues in addition to the ethical issues when you start to think about Facebook, Twitter, and what I call other proprietary social media platforms versus the more old school discussion threads, or working with a platform that you actually know the people, like with an online learning management system at a university or a company's customer service platform. If you have a relationship with the people who own the talk, that of course puts it in an even different category. So once you have decided, that you figured out how you're going to ethically approach extracting data, there is a lot of online talk out there, even on just one platform. So we talk about, and I'm going to have Alyssa talk a little bit about bounding decisions. How do we decide in terms of platform, people, topic, and time, how much data do we actually want to be looking at for a study?
Yeah, so we went from problems of research where you couldn't get enough data to the problem of abundance where there's way too much out there. And I mean, I certainly face that in my work, and I would imagine from a qualitative perspective, what to look at is even more of an important question, because you're looking at it so intently, you really need to know what you're grabbing. So for bounding, and this sort of has two parts to it. So the bounding is really the first stage in sort of setting the scope for what you're going to include and exclude in your quote unquote conversation. And this is a really conceptual decision that is going to depend in part on a lot of the prior decisions that you made earlier in terms of, are you looking at the talk as text, or are you trying to look at talk as people, and also what your object of interest is. Whether you're interested in the topic of the talk or who's talking or how they're talking might change how you bound your data source. So in bounding, you can think about these 4 different dimensions, and platform is sort of where the talk happens. Now, you gave the example of the White Blaze hiking forum, and that's a platform. But what if White Blaze also happened to have a Facebook group? It's the same people talking at the same time, maybe about the same topics, but they're doing it somewhere else. Sort of for convenience, I think we very often bound our studies of online talk to a single platform, but that is always leaving out important parts of the puzzle, because that's not how the talk is experienced. So it's important to think about whether you can make the assumption of only looking at one platform, or if you're going to look at multiple platforms, how do you combine and figure out who the same people are across them? Another dimension is people. So certainly you could say it's everybody who posted on a platform, but you could also take a look at certain subgroups. So for example, there was a study of the Money Saver Expert Forum, and they looked only at super posters, the people who are super, super active. In other studies we've done, we looked at anybody who interacted with an instructor in an online course, because we were interested in the how of how people interact with instructors. So only students who have that interaction were included. You can also think about the fact that in some cases, someone doesn't actually have to talk in a discussion to be present. They could be listening, and they could indicate their presence in a whole bunch of other ways. Certainly in online courses, you can get transaction records of who's looked at what. And then in social media, there can also be likes and retweets and those sorts of things. So you can actually study who's involved without them necessarily saying a word. Topics can be examined in a bunch of ways. It can happen structurally, so you can sort of look at certain threads, or on Twitter or other social media, you can pick a certain hashtag as a way to look at a topic. And that sort of can be done ahead of time. It can also be done post-hoc. So we've done studies where we've gone in and coded manually all the posts that had to do with a certain topic, and then that was how we bounded that part of the talk. We've also built natural language processing classifiers that went in and automatically looked at 10,000 posts and told us which one of them were actually about the topic of a course, and then those became part of our corpus. You can even do something, for example, topic modeling, that would actually model an entire amount of text and then sort of take different parts of the text and associate them with different topics, and then you could study those separately. Time-wise, you can always set an absolute time. I'm going to look at all the posts from 2001 to 2005, or you can do it relatively and say, I'm going to look at the most recent 20 threads or the most recent 20 people. And of course, there's mix and match combinations that you could do across these. So I'm going to study all of the threads that were started by these kinds of people at this point in time. I was just going to add that after you've bounded your data, you still don't have to necessarily analyze all of it, because it could be a whole lot. But this is the amount of data that you're sort of hoping to make claims about. But then at some point, you may also think about a unit of analysis and sampling from the data you've bounded. So for example, in MOOCs, we examined unit of analysis of thread, and we sort of sampled representative threads. In our knowledge construction study, we actually looked at all the posts in a week, regardless of who made them or where they were made. So I know that's a lot of different things to think about, but these are the decisions that really matter, because that makes up your data corpus, and what you include and exclude is going to really determine what you're able to say about what happened.
And I would say I get asked this question probably more than anything, is how much data do I need? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's about having a reason, a justification for why you're looking at the data that you're looking at. And our book can be something that you cite by kind of reading through these options and having a good reason for why you're doing what you're doing. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here so we have time for questions. Once you do decide how you're going to bound your data source, there are lots of different tools for actually getting the data out of the internet and into a platform that you can organize, that you can analyze it. Wasim Ahmed is a digital business expert at the London School of Economics, and he regularly updates this blog post with all these different tools that are out there. There's tons of tools that you can find to get your social media data out. Some are free, some are open source, some require programming knowledge. I've actually had worked with a Python coder before to help me extract data. So we've just put a couple of examples of links here. I'll add that recently Atlas TI, NVivo, and MaxQDA have actually built in tools to bring in Twitter tweets and try to interface better with social media data in their most recent versions of their software. So definitely check that out. And so I will say a lot of these tools do focus on Twitter as opposed to some of the other tools. And Alyssa, I know that you've had to actually build your own tools sometimes to get the data that you need.
Yeah, we will sometimes we'll build our own tools and have people interact with them because it will produce the data we wanted. We did a whole series of studies on how people paid attention to what other people said, but for that we needed post by post information at who looked at what, which most systems don't give you. So we built one to give us that. And then the other thing I was going to add is that a lot of times we also do database queries where we work with developers. And one thing I've found is super helpful is I will make an Excel spreadsheet that is basically a fake data sheet that shows them what I'm hoping to get. Now, I never get exactly what I ask for, but by having to put it down and really think carefully about what variable columns I want, what each row, each observation is going to represent, it really helps me think better about my analysis and helps me communicate with the people who are going to pull the data for me so that I get something at least close to what I'm hoping to eventually work with.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of options. Again, there's not one right way to get it out of there. It's just trying to see what resources you have available to help you get the data in a format that you need. So the last thing we're going to talk about is sort of, okay, now once you get it out and you want to do something with it, you might choose to analyze it quantitatively or qualitatively, depending on, again, which method's going to get you the answer to the research question. And so Alyssa will talk about some quantitative and computational approaches.
Yeah, so I think there's, if you're a qualitative researcher, primarily there's two main values that quantitative and computational approaches can provide. And I think the first one may be the more powerful, which is to figure out where to spend your time looking in depth. And so, you know, as I mentioned before, you can do topic modeling to kind of find a collection of talk that's about the same thing that you then look at in more depth. We've also done a lot of social network analysis. We did a paper recently in Computers and Education that was called Finding Community in the Crowd. And, you know, MOOC discussions are wide ranging and people imagine that people come and go all the time. But by doing a social network analysis, we were able to identify clusters of people who talked with each other again and again across different threads. And then we were able to use that to figure out what specific threads to pull to see how these individuals interacted. And then we did an in-depth qualitative analysis of that to understand how these people were talking that might explain the community building that occurred. On the other side of things, sometimes you observe something really interesting and cool in a small piece of data and you want to see if it's really a pattern. So you can do manual content analysis or build an NLP classifier to see if it shows up anywhere else. And we did a study, this one actually wasn't online, but it was kids collaborating around a tabletop world building experiment. And we saw that in some cases when some students did actions in the system, the other students would actually explain to them what they were doing, and they would use questions to seek confirmation before they took action. And we weren't sure if that was just something we noticed in a couple cases or if it was really going on more widely. And so based on those qualitative observations, we developed a coding scheme. In that case, we did it manually, but since then we've now been able to train classifiers to detect it automatically based on system behaviors and linguistic features.
And I'll say that these approaches are really exciting. I mean, as a qualitative researcher, I used to just pick like the most recent 100 posts because I was doing a manual analysis qualitatively, and I didn't have a tool to help me figure out, if you look across the millions of posts, where is the real action going on that I could then hone in my qualitative analysis. So I think for those of us who are qualitatively minded, we're not going to be able to escape, and we should embrace the fact that there are now some quantitative and computational approaches using NLP as natural language processing to help us figure out where should we put our attention. And so some methods qualitatively, for example, if we just want to know what they're talking about, we can do thematic analysis. And I've used this for a study of whether or not people with HIV/AIDS were aware of, concerned about, or taking action around side effects and long-term risks of their medication. So looking at a support group and what are they talking about in terms of their medication. You could, if you're interested in how stories function, you might use narrative analysis. And I've used this to look at the stories that older adults are telling in their online courses and how those stories function to illustrate phases of the life course. And if you're interested in any of these studies, they're all in the book. You might be interested in the sequential structure of online talk. How does talk function? And so conversation analysis can be useful if you want to look at, for example, customer service chats, right? We've all been, or maybe not all, but you can engage in these instant chats with service providers. And so CA work has looked at service provider client interactions to understand question answer sequences or complaints and how people respond to complaints. And finally, in that online grief support group I was talking about earlier, we used discourse analysis to look at how grief was constructed. It looks at how language is functioning and often around issues of power in a particular context. And so once you complete your analysis, quantitative, qualitative, whatever you decided to do, you need to know if you've answered your question and whether your knowledge claims are trustworthy or not. So if we just go back to that question earlier, how do people make meaning of their own experiences in light of others' experiences through dialogue in the online course? We chose a phenomenological inquiry design and used both thematic and discourse analysis techniques. And then the claims that we made were that there were 4 aspects of meaning making that emerged: noticing, reinterpreting, theorizing about, and questioning assumptions. So again, that's just to reiterate that alignment is really important. And so you want to ask yourself, did we answer our research questions? What evidence was there for our claims? Are there any alternative explanations that need to be considered? And what indicators of trustworthiness and validity are present? And we do go into more detail around that. So I think we've left about 10 minutes for questions, but of course, here's a link to how we can get to the book. And if you want a discount, there's a discount code for you there. And then I'll also be doing kind of a one-day version of this. If anybody's familiar with the Qualitative Research Summer Intensive in Chapel Hill, I'll be there next July. I'd love to see you there. All right, so Ricardo, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Trena and Alyssa. Any questions from the audience? You may either write them down under questions, or you may lift your hand by clicking on the hand icon next to your names in the GoToWebinar control panel. Let me see, at this moment, we don't have yet any questions, so let's wait for people to think about questions. Okay, I have one. Well, in fact, Chu, you raised your hand, but then you lowered it, so maybe that was an accident. If you want to speak, please click on the hand icon again. Let me see. No questions yet. Trena and Alyssa, would you like to maybe, oh, well, here I have the first one. Ricky, I will give you the microphone. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. So I've been working on narrative analysis, discourse analysis, multimodal discourse analysis, and I actually read the book already. And I'm getting to a place where I'm trying to figure out at what point we're able to start really bringing these tools and methods together in ways that might inform each other and create new methods. But I also worry about how they move away from some of the methodological alignment issues. And I just kind of wonder what your take is on that sort of kind of shift that we might make and the problems with that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've encountered, those of us who've tried to apply conversation analysis methods to online talk have encountered a lot of resistance from the old school conversation analysts, who some really insist that you cannot do conversation analysis with online discussions because of the underlying assumptions and requirements of that method. Now, a lot of people have done it and published it. But I do think that I encourage people to do that. I don't know how we can get around it, but I think that being really transparent and thorough in your methods section, and maybe even writing a methodological paper alongside of that, illustrating why you chose to do that, how it's epistemologically congruent with the assumptions of that method and methodology, and kind of what you were able to do and what worked and what didn't. I think those are the sorts of conversations that we need to be having, both in journal articles, at professional conferences, you know, et cetera, because I think that they do, I think it is a two sides of a coin. I think we need new methods to look at online talk, but the online talk also influences old methods in interesting ways and actually lets us apply them to other types of data. I don't know if that's helping at all, but I think it's a really great thing to be wrestling with.
I think we're on the same page. I actually submitted a proposal for, or was asked to do a methods section for a digital discourse collection because of these same concerns and issues. And I think the field is shifting, and I think it's going to take a while. And I think being interdisciplinary can be its own challenge.
Yes.
Bringing these things together, because you still want to hold on to what's working, and really you want to be able to deal with the assumptions that are underlying. But as the tools change and our ways of communicating are changing, we really just need to find some more integrated approaches that allow us to look at multiple things, and then we deal with it being too unbound and too unruly. So I think it's a constant challenge, and I appreciate the work you guys are doing on this.
Well, thanks, and thanks for reading the book. And we were very aware that we wish we could have also talked in the book about multimodal text and images and voice, and like it's so rich. And because there's so much going on in these spaces, we felt like we had to limit it to text because that's what most of us have worked with. But what you're saying is so true. It's like we need more robust ways of thinking about what's going on online, because a lot of it is image-based these days.
Thank you, both of you. Now I will offer the microphone to Rana. Your microphone is opened.
Okay, good. It's evening right here in Namibia. I am a PhD student. I wanted to produce an article, and that article is related to looking at the social media, some of the messages that are coming on social media regarding information use. But I wanted to find out what are the ethical principles that needs to be applied when conducting a study related to online talks.
I'm just going to
or maybe I didn't follow very well.
Yeah, I'm just going to pull up this
Hello?
slide again. Can you see this slide on the Association of Internet Researchers?
Yes.
Yes.
The ethics, yeah.
Yeah, so I really recommend starting by reading their PDF from 2012. They do such a great job, and it's too much to even, get into in detail today. But there are a lot of ethical things to think about, and they do a really great job of putting that all together in sort of a diagram so you can think through some of those issues. It's really smart to think about those things up front. It's partly too because if depending on the social media platform you're interested in, there are actually legal issues around taking somebody's words and analyzing it as data, especially if they're posting as themselves. And so I think thinking about that up front is really important.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and my last question is that, sorry?
Yes, go ahead,
How
please.
will we get the presentation? Can we perhaps be provided with a link where we can get the presentation? Thank you.
You will receive the video of it 3 hours from now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have a final question, Kim. I've struggled with understanding the difference between content analysis and thematic analysis in the context of analysis Twitter data. Any advice would be welcome. We only have 2 minutes, Trena and Alyssa.
Alyssa, do you want to talk about this one, or do you want me to? Because I know you've done some content analysis.
Yeah, so what I would say, and again, Trena may say something different, but from my perspective, content analysis is a very specific thing, and it is not just any analysis of the content. Content analysis is a very particular quantitative method where what you do is you figure out a system of codes where you might want to say, does this post contain aspects of explanation? Does it contain negotiation? Does it contain questions? And you go through and you code and you either say, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. Or you might have something where there's 5 levels and you want to say, how rich is this post on a scale from 1 to 5? And the idea is that you have very, very careful predefined criteria that you compare each post to, and you're going to most likely, for some portion of your data, have 2 separate coders making the same decision, and they should be agreeing with each other most of the time in order for you to say that's really the truth of that post. And if that doesn't happen, you've got a problem with your scheme. So that's how I think of content analysis, as a very particular quantitative methodology to apply numbered codes to qualitative data that then you can use for other analysis.
Right.
Thank you very much.
You can code and count at the end of the day, whereas thematic analysis generally doesn't make claims related to quantification.
Thank you very much, both of you. And we are coming to the end. Jeff is recommending the book, the work of Brown and Clark for thematic analysis.
I agree with that.
Yeah, okay. And I want to tell you, Trena, that Kelly Angus said hello to you. She's a former student of yours from UT.
Wonderful.
Okay. And well, we are coming to the end. Thank you very much, both of you. Now, I would like to ask Juliana to say a few final words. Juliana, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you, Trena and Alyssa, for that talk. It was very informative. A very brief mention about some things we have coming up with IIQM. Many of you are probably aware of the Qualitative Health Research Conference coming up in Vancouver, October 25th through 29th. Pre-conference workshops the 25th and 26th, and conference 27th through the 29th. Wonderful response to that, and if you're in the Vancouver area, I encourage you to take a look at our website. We also have a new series of workshops in the fall, November 8th through 29th on Fridays. If you're in the Edmonton area, Fall Qual. This is a little bit of a spin-off from thinking qualitatively in terms of workshops, and I'd encourage you to take a look at our website for that. We have another webinar coming up tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Times through our Mixed Methods webinar series. So in brief, please take a look at our website or write to me at iiqm@ualberta.ca.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can join us in the next session of this webinar series. We have had this webinar series for about, 6 years now, and this series is only possible with your support. So thank you, all of you, for coming from so many different countries and from so many different professional backgrounds. Thank you, Trena and Alyssa, for your presentation today, and thank you, all of you. Bye-bye. Thank you.